Good evening and welcome to our Attorney General Candidate Forum. My name is Christina Jackson and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Council of Lawyers. I want to start by thanking those who made today's program possible, members of our Advocacy Committee, our incredible Forum Planning Committee, and our wonderful moderators. I also want to recognize the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law for their support in facilitating this event. Before I introduce our moderators and the candidates, I just want to take a moment to tell you more about Washington Council of Lawyers. We are a voluntary bar association here in DC, committed to ensuring that our legal system treats everyone fairly, regardless of money, position, or power. Through events like this one, we strive to build and strengthen our public interest community to be energized, mobilized, and informed. Our advocacy around access to justice issues makes us a strong voice in the public interest legal community. And Washington Council of Lawyers stands ready to help our next Attorney General pursue goals of equal access and an equitable justice system. You can follow our conversation this evening on social media. We will be live tweeting at the handle @WashLawyers, and we'll put that in the chat. We're using the hashtag DCAGForum22. And as I said before, our conversation will be recorded and you can find it up on our YouTube channel along with other incredible content, if I do say so myself. This evening, we will hear from the three Democratic candidates for DC Attorney General, Ryan Jones, Brian Schwalb, and Bruce Spiva. They will be making opening statements shortly where they will have an opportunity to introduce themselves. But first, let me tell you, the candidates and moderators have agreed to the following ground rules for our discussion. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement and 2 minutes for a closing statement. Each candidate will be asked the same question and have the same amount of time to answer. Responses to each question will be limited to either 60 seconds or 90 seconds, and the moderators will announce the time limit at the beginning of each new question. The timekeeper will signal the end of each time allotment by an electronic notification, and the speaker has agreed to end their answer within 10 seconds. The moderators will introduce the candidates in a minute using name and title only, and thereafter, Mr. will be used. The timekeeper and moderators will have the authority to interrupt candidates who do not comply with the time limits. Candidates are asked not to interrupt each other or will refrain from personal attacks or charges. Candidates' answers should remain focused on the relevant policy topics, and their closing statement should be significantly related to the matters discussed at the forum. Now I'm pleased to introduce our moderators, Shelley Broderick and Colby King. Professor Broderick is Dean Emerita and Joseph L. Raw Jr. Chair of Social Justice at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law, where she previously served as Dean for 20 wonderful years. She currently chairs the DC Task Force on Jails and Justice and serves on the boards of DC Appleseed and DC Vote. And among her many contributions to the DC public interest legal community, she was a founder of the DC Consortium of Legal Services Providers. She's also been honored numerous times, and if we listed them all here, we'd be here all night, for her exemplary legal career dedicated to service in the public interest. Colby King is a columnist and deputy editor of the editorial page for the Washington Post. In 2003, Mr. King won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his against the grain columns that speak to people in power with ferocity and wisdom. He is also a regular panelist on ABC's Inside Washington and a regular commentator on WTOP radio. Earlier in his career, he served as a bank executive, held positions in the U.S. Department of the Treasury and the U.S. State Department, and was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Adjutant General's Corps. Shelley and Colby, I'm so grateful to you for being with us this evening. And now I will turn the screen over to Colby King to begin our discussion.
Well, before we begin the discussion, I would like to thank the co-sponsors of this event, and that includes the Access to Justice Commission, the ACLU of DC, the American Constitution Society of the DC Bar Chapter, the Council for Court Excellence, the DC Consortium of Legal Services Providers, the DC Bar Antitrust Consumer Affairs Community.
And I will continue the list by mentioning the DC Bar DC Affairs Community, the DC Justice Lab, DC Guaranteed Income Coalition, Greater Washington Area Chapter, Washington Lawyers Division of the National Bar Association, the Inter-American Bar Association, and the IABA DC Chapter, and the Washington Bar Association. Now, we're going to each make brief comments about why this is important to us. I've been a lawyer in Washington, D.C. all of my career, and I've spent that time at your public law school, UDC, your tax dollars at work. We have 9 clinics, and we represent tens of thousands of low-income residents across all poverty-related issues. As Christine mentioned, I'm a co-founder of the Consortium of Legal Services Providers. Our mission to improve the quality, increase the quantity, and coordinate the delivery of legal services. Poverty is real, and it's only growing in the District of Columbia. The racial disparities are worse and worse. There's so much I look forward to hearing on these issues from our candidates tonight. I want to know their priorities and their principles. Colby, over to you.
Well, thank you. I want to say one thing, Christina. I am a former deputy editor of the editorial page of the Washington Post, but I am still a columnist, and I've been around for over 30 years. This is a particularly important forum we're having. The AG, the Attorney General of the District of Columbia, is the latest voter-created political position on a partisan basis. The AG is not only the city's chief legal officer and enforcer of district laws. Under the stewardship of Carl Racine, the DC's first and only elected Attorney General, the scope of the job has been expanded beyond the law books. It's gone into the world of social and political arenas as well. We have seen the DC Attorney General's office extended into partisan political process with the endorsement of mayoral candidates and with candidates for the DC Council. This forum is designed to give voters some insight into the positions of the AG candidates so that the voters can make informed decisions on election day. I'm looking forward to this very much and hope to hear answers from the candidates. Thank you very much.
And now it's time to introduce the candidates for their opening statements. Ryan Jones, Principal, Ryan L. Jones Law, LLC. Brian Schwalb, Partner in Charge, DC Office of Venable, LLP. And Bruce Spiva, former Managing Partner of the DC Office of Perkins and Coyle. You'll each have 2 minutes for your opening statement. We're going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Mr. Jones, and then Mr. Schwalb, and then Mr. Spiva. Mr. Jones?
Good evening, everyone. Washington Council of Lawyers, thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm Ryan Jones. I'm a candidate for DC Attorney General. I'm honored to be here and share the stage and give you the opportunity to understand why it is that I'm running. I'm a native Washingtonian and want nothing more than to give back to the city that's given me so much. And I recognize the deep disparities that are growing in Washington, D.C. We need new leaders, new visions to cure old problems. I know there's somebody who woke up in a single family home today under warm sheets with the opportunity to go downstairs and reach into the refrigerator and grab a product to start their day. But I also know that there's someone else that woke up in deplorable conditions, less than humane, without the opportunity to achieve a life or a day of living that we consider up to standard or par. And there are millions of hands that play part in this role. There are ships that sail seas during the evening and planes that fly the skies, all regulated by law. People like us that make it possible. And what we do matters to the everyday lives. And so, as we sit here today to discuss the future of Washington, D.C. and the opportunity to lead the city in a brighter direction, I relish the opportunity to tell you about myself, my experience, and just how I'll be able to lead Washington, D.C. successfully as the Chief Legal Officer to the government, which requires an innovative legal mind to take on these challenges that we face today in the wake of a pandemic that's decimated a system that we took so seriously and now have to revitalize in order to uplift people. And that's why I'm running. I'm running to rewire a system so that the government can empower lives of district residents across the city.
Mr. Schwalb?
Thank you. My name is Brian Schwalb. I'm a third generation Washingtonian. My mother was born here. My grandfather born here. I've got 3 daughters who were born here in Washington who are fourth generation Washingtonians. I came back to DC after law school and a clerkship to join the Justice Department in the Clinton administration. My wife, Mickey, and I were fortunate enough to buy a house, which we've lived in for the last 30 years and raised our girls here. I got a lot of good advice from my dad before he passed away. And one piece of wisdom was that God gives us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should always try to listen twice as much as we talk. And I've taken that lesson throughout my legal career and on to being a candidate for the first time, listening to Washingtonians all across our city, in all of the wards of our city, in neighborhoods, from side to side in our city. And what I hear consistently is that people are proud to be Washingtonians, proud in the history, unique history we have in our city, the natural beauty of our parks and our rivers, the culture and the arts and the restaurants and the sports teams. People are very proud that people come to Washington to do important work on the national and international stage. We are a magnet for talent. We are abundant in resources. We do not have a resource problem in DC. We have a resource distribution problem. We don't share the equity and the income and the opportunity that we are awash in here in DC fairly and equitably across all of our city. And that is what I think is the most significant long-term challenge to all of our collective futures for all of us who love Washington. And I think the law is the single most powerful tool we have to address that. And that's why the decision of who our next Attorney General is, into whose hands do we entrust the law, is such an important decision. It's why I am very proud that our current Attorney General, Carl Racine, has endorsed me, as has our prior Attorney General, Irv Nathan, arguably 2 men in our city who know better than anyone what it takes to do this job and do well. I'm a first-time candidate. I'm a fair election candidate. I want to bring what I'm good at and what I'm passionate about in service of a city I love.
Thank you. My name is Bruce Spiva. You know, I've never forgotten that I stand on the shoulders of others, most prominently my mother and my late father, who both grew up in the Jim Crow era South. And they were both the first in their families that were able to get a higher education and went on to lives of service to others. My father graduated from an HBCU in 1954, the year that the Brown decision came down. And my dad believed in the power of the law to change our lives for the better, particularly minority folks. He inspired me to pursue a career in the law. He instilled in me a sense of duty and courage to fight for change. And that's why I've spent the last 30 years fighting for everyday people. As a civil rights lawyer, I've taken on the tough fights and delivered for the folks that I represented. I took on slumlords and the district government itself to fight housing discrimination against Black and Latino and Asian residents of Columbia Heights who had been pushed out of their homes to make way for luxury condos. I took on the MPD on behalf of a Howard University freshman and sexual assault victim whose case was badly mishandled by the police. As a result of our case, the council passed a law that provided critical protections for sexual assault survivors. I have fought for DC statehood in and out of the courtroom. And in 2020, I argued in the United States Supreme Court to fight against Republican efforts to suppress minority votes. I am ready and prepared as Attorney General to stand up to the powerful, whether it be unscrupulous corporations slumlords, polluters, or the government itself. I'm ready to take on these fights because in my 30 years of practice, I've taken them on before and won. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Colby?
Yeah, I know there's broad agreement among you on a number of issues. I want to get down into the weeds on one question from the outset. Attorney General Racine created a public advocacy division with sections including civil rights, elder justice, and social justice. Upon assuming the role of Attorney General, will you choose to continue this public advocacy division? And if so, what specific priorities would you have for this division? We have 60 seconds. I'm going to start with Mr. Schwalb, then Mr. Spiva, and Mr. Jones.
Thank you for the question. And the answer is yes, I would intend to preserve and build on the foundation that AG Racine has built with the Public Advocacy Division. The key to that division is leaning into the statutory obligation to fight for and protect the public interest in the District of Columbia. That has been in housing justice, in fighting for workers and fighting against a scourge of wage theft. It's dealing with issues of consumer protection and protecting people in the city who are oftentimes vulnerable to scam artists and price gouging. Too often our seniors are subject to being taken advantage of. The Public Advocacy Division and the excellent lawyers in that division and professionals are fighting for all of us in the public interest. It's also protecting our environment. So those are areas that I would continue to lean into and build on. There are other areas that I think should be expanded, including some of the discriminatory barriers to entry, both to home ownership and business ownership, as well as dealing with traffic violence in our city. Those are areas that I would expand the Public Advocacy Division into.
Thank you. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I would continue. I think it's an excellent division that does important work, and it has many excellent attorneys and other professionals that carry on that work. And I am excited about that because this is the type of thing that I've been fighting for all my career. At one time, when I was a partner at a large law firm and a younger lawyer, and I had 2 kids under the age of 2 at that time. I started my own law firm to do exactly the types of work that they do, fighting for consumer protection, fighting for antitrust enforcement and civil rights. And so I know how to do these cases based on the experience of actually doing them. I've been the David against the Goliath in these cases. And so if I'm elected, I want to focus in particular on the issues of housing justice, workers' rights. I've represented labor unions in my career, and consumer protection. And those are the types of things that I've been working on for many years now.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yes, thank you, Mr. King. I do plan on expanding public advocacy. I've mentioned in the past, and my colleagues are aware, that I want to use angel litigation funding to expand that. That would bring in that concept to create more funding, to bring in outside counsel in order to take on interesting and important battles in our courtrooms, as we know that is the best way to exact justice in our current system. So we also have issues of landlord-tenant matters and how are we going to get representation to tenants, and sometimes landlords we need the most. I believe we need to insert counsel there. I believe we also need to have opportunities to protect businesses that do business in Washington, D.C., small businesses that legal fees could be crushing to. And they do serve an important role in our city. So if we can provide counsel to them as well to keep the important business interests alive and protected through the courts, I want to make sure that they know that Attorney General of Washington, D.C. will have their back.
Thank you guys. So here's your next question. The OAG has worked closely with legal services providers and advocates to address housing insecurity, housing conditions, and evictions. What is your assessment of these types of partnerships? Are there issues beyond housing that the OAG might partner with others on? Let's start with Mr. Spiva, then Mr. Jones, and then Mr. Schwalb. Mr. Spiva? you're up.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think that it's an excellent program and a way of approaching that. In addition to having a great deal of experience with these issues myself, I also sat on the board of the DC Bar Foundation for many years, and we worked very hard with the council to get a number to increase the access to justice and attorneys who could represent particularly tenants in eviction proceedings. And I think this is an excellent way to both stay engaged with the community and extend the reach of the office to do good, working with the public interest community and the types of lawyers who are members of this, the DC, the Washington Council of Lawyers, to learn from them and to work with them to try to solve these issues. And so I think that works in housing. I think it could work in a number of other issues in terms of workers' rights and the like. Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
Yes. So I believe it is important work. One, we're making sure that we're incorporating many others in the legal community that need it the most. People who are in public interest law firm have special skill sets that they've honed over years, and we need to empower them with our budget, giving them good work to do. So yes, I agree with partnering with other like legal aid societies of the world, your ACLUs, and ensuring that they have the funding to achieve their important mission. We're watching issues like Roe v. Wade come to a head, and issues like that we need we need excellent attorneys on the front lines of. And as Attorney General, I would want to charge those institutions up so that their lawyers can take on these important battles in courtrooms and exact the justice we know we need so much.
Thank you. Mr. Schwalb?
So I think there's an important partnership that needs to be played between the AG's office and legal services providers. There are unique cases that are proper for an AG to take on, impact advocacy cases where there are patterns and practices that are evident that can be taken on through litigation in an impact way that changes behavior. Oftentimes, legal services providers and their clients are closest to the ground to where facts and patterns are being seen and developed. And so it's very important to have clear lines of communication and cooperation. The AG's office under my leadership is never going to tell anybody that comes in, it's not our job. AG lawyers are going to do what lawyers have been doing for years, which is addressing the needs and solving problems that clients and residents of the District of Columbia have. And oftentimes that's referring and partnering with legal service partners on the important cases involving housing and discrimination and otherwise. I've already talked about partnering with unions. I've been gotten the endorsement of several of the labor unions talking about how labor unions can help us bring wage theft and human trafficking and labor trafficking cases to the forefront. So partnering with our community and community organizations is essential.
Attorney General was launched the OAG Restorative Justice Program, which is supposed to be the first of its kind in the nation. What is, in behalf of listeners, and what is restorative justice? And how does it apply to the AG functions? And I have in mind domestic violence area and civil protection orders. But tell people what you think restorative justice means. We're going to start with Mr. Jones, and then Mr. Schwalb, and Mr. Spiva. You have 90 seconds, please.
Yes, I understand that Washington, D.C. has the best and the premier restorative justice program in the country. And I applaud Carl Racine's efforts, and I want to do nothing more than to take that to another level. So restorative justice looks like this, and it has two parts, as I see it. One, it is creating a program of exacting punishment to bad actors such that they are allowed to have a chance on the other side of that bad action with diversion programs and making sure that their punishment is commensurate with their actions, but also giving them a chance to participate in society without being harmed too harshly. We're also talking about how victims are harmed by these types of actions and how do victims get better and recover on the other side of an awful act. So We're balancing harms in a different way other than the normal standards of punishment by throwing people in jail. As Attorney General of Washington, D.C., you have purview over juvenile offenses and adult misdemeanors. So when we're talking about how do we achieve the goal of rehabilitation, we need to think about several types of opportunities to allow the offenders to, one, be held accountable, but also have a real chance at returning to society as meaningful contributors. And this restorative justice program does that effectively and is one that should be mimicked across the country. And I want to make sure that we enhance it.
Mr. Schwalb.
So I think you're right, Mr. King, that under Carl Racine's leadership, our Attorney General's office is the only prosecutor's office in the country that has included a restorative justice element to the prosecutorial process. But restorative justice wasn't new to us here in Washington. It's got a track record of meeting really unique need that unfortunately our criminal justice system has not historically met. It does two things. It helps break cycles of violence and retaliation and trauma that too often occurs when we're dealing with violence, because it allows victims and perpetrators to sit down with one another, and for the people who have committed crimes to hear directly from the people they've harmed what those impacts have been on their lives, on their families' lives. It allows for hopefully an agreement and an understanding to be reached between perpetrator and victim, that rather than retaliation and deep-seated hatred, there's a healing that can happen. And that in the long run makes us safer and juster and a kinder community when we can lean into that. It's important sometimes when cases can't be made on the evidence. If the evidence isn't there, restorative justice can be a way of having closure through an agreement. And I think your idea of expanding it into domestic violence and into other areas where you have violence and retaliation and resentment, so that people can own and build their empathy with people who they're harming, is an excellent idea that the Attorney General should continue to lead on.
Thank you. Mr. Spiva.
Yes, my understanding of the restorative justice program is it's a program that is both victim centered and centered on rehabilitating the perpetrator of the crime through a process that Mr. Schwalb just described of the perpetrator hearing from the victim of the crime, coming to understand the damage that has been done, and in the process and making amends is a key part of it. So it's not simply a free pass, if you will. It's a different way of making amends to the victim, and in the process, hopefully putting the perpetrator back on the right track. And I think it is a good program. It's a program I would look to continue and potentially expand. I would want to be very cautious, I think, about expanding it to domestic violence, because in a situation like that, you want to make sure, I think a key component of restorative justice is making sure that the victim truly is voluntarily entering this process, and there's a power imbalance and also an emotional psychological factor there that we'd want to be very careful that we didn't end up promoting a cycle of domestic violence through the restorative justice program. So I'm not saying that should never not be done, but I'd want to be very cautious there. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next question. The Child Support Services Division is OAG's largest section. The division's work in establishing and enforcing child support orders is sometimes balanced against the reality that those obligated to pay child support often face real barriers to obtaining and maintaining employment in the district. As AG, how would you support, encourage, or incentivize those obligated to pay child support to meet their obligations? Do you have any other specific goals for CSSD? You'll have 90 seconds. We'll start with Mr. Schwalb, move to Mr. Spiva, and then finish off with Mr. Jones.
I think that for almost everything the Attorney General and the lawyers and the professionals in the AG's office do every day, the fundamental question that needs to get asked is why? Why are certain patterns or circumstances or facts occurring? Too often, we don't ask that question, and therefore, for the custodial parent who is not receiving child support and the non-custodial parent is allegedly delinquent, we don't ask why it is that the payments aren't being made. I think there's a difference between being a deadbeat dad, and too often these situations involve fathers who are not paying, not only fathers, but being a deadbeat dad and being a dead broke dad. And there is a difference. We need to be mindful that many non-custodial parents want to be actively engaged in their kids' lives. They want to participate, but they also need to make a living. And we have barriers to making a living in our city that the AG's office can really tackle and advocate to change. One specific example is the clean hands statute that's in existence in our city right now. That statute should be amended. It's a statute that says if you have more than $100 of fines, parking tickets or speeding tickets, you can't get your license renewed, which means that you're put between a terrible rock and a hard place of either driving with an expired license, which is illegal, or not getting to work. The AG can advocate for those types of concrete legislative changes that would make it easier for people who are too often struggling between making a living so that they can afford their obligations to their kids.
Thank you. A high functioning child support system will be a very high priority for me. I think we need to make sure that it's a system that is balanced and fair, both for petitioners and respondents alike. This is really an anti-poverty program. Too often, appropriate child support orders are not put into place, and the children suffer because of it. But we do have to make sure that we are balancing this so that where you do have the dead broke non-custodial parent, that we aren't simply making it harder for them in the end to actually meet their obligations. In addition, there's legislation pending around paternity, and there are situations where there are certain presumptions that are put into place, even if there's a DNA test that shows that the person is not actually the biological father of the child. So I do think this is a place where there's room for reform. I think a high priority that hasn't really been there in the current AG's office needs to be placed on this to make sure it's functioning well. And during the pandemic, it really hasn't been functioning well at all. And so it would be a very high priority for me.
Mr. Jones.
Yes, thank you. So I recognize that the failure to pay child support has been weaponized against too many. It puts people in jail in a worse position to actually step up and take care of their responsibilities. I recognize we need to treat them, or folks who can't pay, differently. How do we get people back to work, getting the opportunity to earn money to pay their obligations? That means working with council. That means working with the mayor, recognizing the people that actually are having the hardest of times in order to meet their obligations. That means participating. That means showing up. That means being responsible. And so I've been an attorney for a friend of mine who was dealing with one of these issues. And I recognize just how difficult it was for him. And I'm reminded by him when I come into these forums to share his story and recognize what it puts him through, his family through, and that we need different ways of addressing it. It's an age-old system that I don't think works by, harming people, that give them a harsh record and being in contempt of court and then harming them to go and get jobs. That's why expungements are so critical. And I would talk about that in hopefully in the coming questions. However, I do recognize that we can revitalize this department. It's an expanded and large department, but we need to address things differently. And that means creating policy. And so we are going to have to advocate and lobby before council and the mayor to change the way we work the system.
Well, let's continue the assessment of the OAG. What do you think of the work that's been done by the OAG in the area of consumer protection, including addressing predatory lending and getting after groups that defund or misuse funds while conducting business in the district? Can more be done? Can the AG do more? You got 60 seconds to grapple with this question. I'm going to ask Mr. Spivey first, Mr. Jones, and then Mr. Schwalb. You're up, Mr. Spivey.
Thank you, Spiva. Again, think this is a very important area for the district. And I think the current consumer protection part of the public advocacy division is doing really great work that I would want to continue and support and even expand. The areas that you mentioned are critical. Unfair debt collection, particularly for our seniors. There's also a lot of fraud going on out there in terms of seniors' homes being taken by fraudsters who prey on them. And I'm really well placed to support the division and expand it, because this is the type of work that I've been doing most of my career. As I said, I did consumer protection cases in my own law firm for many years and recovered for everyday folks.
Mr. Jones.
Yes, sorry. The way I look at the Attorney General's work is trying to create prevention and intervention. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about criminal actions and criminal actors. I do mean it in a civil sense, especially when we're talking about what you mentioned, predatory lending. These types of actors are sending mail to homes, emails, even texting. And these are service providers which get the fraud into the hands of our residents. And I think we can start taking court action so we can get an injunction against the service providers to allow these types of services, their services, to be used against residents. We know who these bad actors are, and they're sending out these notices, seeking to have predatory lending, for example, refinance your home here. Let's not even have them have the opportunity to reach residents. But let's also use the law and use litigation, even though that's the sole process, to prevent these bad actors from acting in a harsh way towards our residents.
So I think that the consumer protection work that the AG's office is essential. It's essential to advancing and protecting the public interest. And whenever anybody comes into our city or is in our city and is taking advantage of people, the law needs to stand up and prevent that from happening. And the AG is often the only and most powerful force to push back against people who would prey on others for purposes of making a profit. I think that one of the areas that's most important for us to keep in mind when allocating resources in the AG is to figure out when it is the people of the District of Columbia, and oftentimes the most vulnerable, who are being most damaged by the practices. For example, when there's price gouging going on, when there's healthcare shortages and people are being held up and gouged on pricing. And certainly as we deal with a real estate market that is a very, very expensive market, we need to do a good job of letting particularly senior homeowners know that they are the targets of a homeowner scam where people are trying to steal the equity of their home from them.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on using antitrust or other bodies of law like price control as tools to protect DC consumers from the effects of inflation, especially as we see gasoline and other price hikes every day? How long should controls remain in place if enacted? You have 90 seconds, and we're going to start with Mr. Jones, move to Mr. Schwab, and end with Mr. Spiva. Sorry. Colby's got me going now. We're going to get each other going.
All right. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you. So I think litigation brought in federal district court for the District of Columbia is a proper place to bring antitrust action. I understand also that we can bring action in our local DC Superior Court, maybe in tandem with other attorneys around the country, other attorneys general around the country. And we do this as a way to attack a sophisticated scheme of maybe international actors who are very smart and know how to work a system that they've been acting in for many years. So to be a shield for our residents requires some good coordination and actually figuring out, can we make a case? We need to know where the, I guess, conspiring is taking place among the providers of a particular industry, and if it's actually real. Are they depressing certain types of services to keep prices controlled? Are they, controlling how amount of people that can actually engage? We have to figure that out. So we have to work with others to figure out, do we actually have a real claim? But I do believe litigation and using the courts is the best way to bring justice to these bad actors. So antitrust litigation is difficult litigation, and it requires possibly outside counsel in order to preserve the manpower of the office. And I would try to charge up those experts in the field to work with us to make sure we're bringing these bad actors to account.
Thank you. Mr. Schwalb?
Yeah, the short answer is the antitrust laws, both our District of Columbia antitrust law and our federal antitrust law, Sherman Act and otherwise, are part of the arsenal that the AG office has to protect people who live in the District of Columbia. That is the objective. And I think you have to start as AG with the question of, are the anti-competitive practices that are going on hurting people in the District of Columbia? To the extent they're elevating the cost of already very expensive goods and services in our city, and people are paying more than a free market and a competitive market would allow itself for, those are areas that are ripe for investigation of, and where appropriate, bringing antitrust actions. So much of the antitrust work that's being done is in collaboration with state AGs across the country, because a lot of the practices that are anti-competitive are not limited to the District of Columbia, but they're nationwide practices. That's why being an attorney who has practiced for a lot of years, handling a lot of different complicated matters in collaboration and teamwork with teams of lawyers is essential. I think another thing that's very important for us to keep in mind when we're playing on the stage of the national antitrust enforcement space is that it raises the stature of us as a city and our office as a premier state AG. We want to be a thought leader on the issues that are most important to the things happening not only in our city, but in our country. And with big tech and with consolidation of industries, our AG and the lawyers in our office should be fighting that fight along shoulder with the AGs across the country.
Mr. Spiva?
Thank you. First, I will say I'm not for price controls, because that was part of the original question. I am very much in favor of legislation of laws that prevent price gouging, which is very different, taking advantage of an emergency situation to spike the prices up. I am an antitrust lawyer. I'm a plaintiff's side antitrust lawyer, in addition to being a civil rights and voting rights lawyer. As I said, I started my own firm where I fought big tech for raising the price of ebooks. I fought big oil for misuse of a patent that caused the increase in price of oil, and achieved a settlement that resulted in $50 million going towards clean air, improving clean air. So it's in my DNA to be on this side of things, and I would very much look forward to supporting the work of the excellent lawyers who do antitrust in the public advocacy division. I've worked with some of them before, and I've also have lots of experience working on these large cases where you are working nationwide with other classes, because usually nationwide class actions are truly collections of state class actions for some details that I won't get into because it would put everybody to sleep. But that is something that I have done before successfully, and I would look forward to doing it as Attorney General.
Mr. Spiva, I again apologize for mispronouncing your name.
No worries.
We're going to take turns mispronouncing it.
That's okay.
I would only note that during the 3-judge panel hearing the appeal to the Board of Elections decision, that the judge also had to ask your counsel for the pronunciation of your name. So I'm in good company, but I just want to let you know, I'm sorry.
No, no worries. I argued a case in the Supreme Court and they mispronounced it there too, even though I'd spelled it phonetically for them. So
Well, let me get to my question. The unemployment has surged during the pandemic, and district residents have complained about problems of securing unemployment insurance and fair treatment while working. Two-part question. Are those complaints legitimate? And also, has the AG taken all the steps necessary to support district workers? What more should the AG be doing? 60 seconds. Candidate sequence, Mr. Schwalb, Mr. Spiva, and Mr. Jones.
I think that the challenge that protecting workers in the District of Columbia that the AG office has is that we have been in a pandemic that has fundamentally changed the economy of our city and the way in which businesses work. It was a health challenge that shuttered businesses. Every one of us knows somebody who lost a business or lost their job during the pandemic. And for some of those realities, the law and in rigorous enforcement of law wasn't going to solve the question. The AG's office does, though, have to be vigilant in doing all it can to protect DC workers. And where that comes to bear is specifically, for example, enforcement of our human rights statute, our anti-discrimination statute in the District of Columbia, to make sure that in this new era of work, where we have a different way of working, oftentimes remote working, gig working, the part-time in the office, that we still are vigorously protecting people against being discriminated both in getting jobs and being advanced in their work.
thank you. I think I'm up next on this one. Okay. As I understood the question, it was really about unemployment benefits and the ability of people to get the unemployment benefits that they are due. And I certainly, based on my understanding, there has been a big problem with that in terms of the timeliness of the payment of unemployment benefits. And to the extent it's partly a public sector problem, agencies not doing what they were supposed to do when they're supposed to do it, I do think the Attorney General should play a role, even as a counselor of those agencies, to have them make it right and to do it on a more timely basis. That is, I think, our job, to protect the public interest, even in counseling our own client. To the extent it is a private sector problem, employers not doing what they're supposed to do to make sure that people have the unemployment insurance in place, and I certainly would go after that affirmatively.
Mr. Jones.
Yes, so before DOES workers are to be paid out unemployment benefits, what we're seeing now is a high number of fraud cases, and those fraud cases are having an unforeseen impact. For example, when the fraud happens, it's paid out potentially to this fraudulent actor. And then when the actual employee is let go and they need to receive unemployment benefits, it's now not getting to them quickly because it's being registered as being paid out. And what's worse is that same unemployed person that can't get the unemployment benefits, they're then being taxed on it in the next year because it's recognizing them as being paid out, and now they're being harmed double time. So I believe that the mayor and the Office of Attorney General need to infuse more capital into contracts that then have representation before DOES and the Office of Administrative Hearings to allow representation to stand in to address these issues, to enable them to get workers paid and employers protected against any fraudulent acts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here's a question near and dear to my heart. This is a moment of opportunity to grow DC government lawyers' participation in pro bono. In 2018, Carl Racine promulgated a pro bono policy for OAG lawyers, and the Mayor's Office of Legal Counsel promulgated a similar policy last fall. And there's now unopposed legislation that clarifies that DC government lawyers may provide pro bono services in local DC courts. How would you promote and incentivize pro bono within the OAG? You each have 60 seconds, and we're going to start with Mr. Spiva, move to Mr. Jones, and then close it down with Mr. Schwalb.
Yeah, I think it's so important to incentivize pro bono, and I think lawyers want to do pro bono. I think what I found when I was the managing partner of the DC office of Perkins Coie, and also I also sat on the firm's executive committee, which is the governing body for the whole firm. So this was an important topic firm wide. Is that what gets tracked and what gets praised by management is what people do. I mean, I don't want to understate the fact that people do it because they feel a professional obligation to do it. But too often, particularly in the private sector, there's so much emphasis on the billable hour that it falls by the wayside. You know, obviously there aren't the same incentives in the government, but I think, you know, tracking it, praising it, encouraging it, and also, you know, counting it. I mean, it's supposed to be pro bono, but counting it as part of something that is in your evaluation, going towards how you ultimately get compensated, are ways to improve that.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
That's an interesting question. My initial thought is a tax credit. If we are allowing attorneys to step in, maybe even attorneys that wouldn't necessarily take a case pro bono, but they're working hours and hours, and it is a lot of work. And maybe they can assess their hours, and I'd have to balance this with the rules of professional responsibility because I don't know that it's possible if lawyers are working in a pro bono capacity to then receive a tax credit for the work that they're doing. And that way we can get more people incentivized to participate in, you know, these representations to increase access to justice, because there are a lot of cases that attorneys just won't take because the cost benefit analysis isn't there. How much are you going to have to pay in fees to the courts? And you have to go through the tremendous process of trying to get those fees waived, that is your filing motions and so on and so forth. So the cost of litigation is expensive. However, if we can provide a tax credit to attorneys, that way they can have the financial support and incentive to participate and get good counsel for people that need it the most.
Mr. Schwalb?
We spent a lot of time at Venable in my role in leadership here at firm thinking about this issue and how do we create opportunities for our lawyers, partners, and associates to engage in pro bono work, both our transactional lawyers and our litigators. We set up a fellowship with Bread for the City, where we have our associates spend 6-month stints at Bread for the City, litigating on behalf of clients, often in housing, where they get paid by the firm and they get the experience associated with being on their feet in court. For OAG lawyers, there are already many of them on their feet in court. So you need to be creative and lead from the top, I believe. One way you lead through this is by example. As AG, I will do what I've continued to do throughout my career, including trying death penalty cases pro bono, taking on excessive police force cases pro bono, taking on housing cases pro bono. I believe if I and the leadership of the office are engaged and lead by example, other lawyers will follow. There are many lawyers in the AG's office who may be doing a certain type of work, but would like to try other parts. And pro bono offers that opportunity as well.
Thank you very much. Workplace culture is at the top of the minds of many district business leaders. What experience do you have managing the work of a large organization? Second part of the question, the OAG structure itself, does it foster a positive and efficient workplace? We have 60 seconds for this. In sequence, Mr. Jones, Mr. Schwalb, and Mr. Spiva. Mr. Jones.
I don't. There's the first part of the question. I don't have experience managing a large institution. 2, I have never been in the office of Attorney General to know what the culture is like, to know how I would be able to impact it. So I would be coming with an entirely fresh set of ideas and ideology that would be, and I'm asking you as voters to entrust in me, say I have the moral compass and the concepts necessary to step into this role and do the hard work and surround myself with the right people to execute the mission of the office seamlessly as I step into a role that I'm not hiding from anyone here, that I would have the requisite experience to say that I've done. I have not managed a large organization. And secondly, the culture of the Office of Attorney General, I don't know. So it would be a steep learning curve. And I expect or hope that you could look at my record and say, hey, look, the guy graduated in 2.5 years, got an LLM, started a law firm, has been successful in the practice of law. He can get this work done.
Thank you.
So for the last more than a decade, I've been involved in running a large legal firm and large teams. Before that, I was leading large teams of trial attorneys trying all kinds of cases. But starting in 2012, I served as the vice chairman of Venable, our nationwide platform. And for the last 6 years as partner in charge of our DC office, which is our largest office, more than 325 lawyers and more than 600 professionals. Workplace culture is essential. I think tone at the top means a lot when you're establishing the culture. And one of the things that's extraordinary about the work that AG Racine has done is he has created a culture and a pride in the office that not just the AG lawyers and professionals in that office feel, but all of us across the District of Columbia feel in terms of excellence. I think you create a culture of wanting lawyers and professionals, all of us who are essentially independent and unleadable, to find professional success on whatever metrics they measure it. Some people want to be on their feet trying cases. Other people want to be putting their time to making the city a more just place. Other people have a specific area of law they want to use their minds to get into. And a successful environment allows professionals to find success on whatever metric makes them happy.
Thank you. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. I've experienced managing both a large law firm as a member of the executive committee, the governing body of Perkins Coie, 1,200 lawyers and over $1.1 billion in revenue, and as the managing partner of the DC office. But I'm most proud of the fact that I formed and maintained my own law firm. We were small, but we did great work, and in some ways that's where I got my best management training. The time that I managed the DC office was through a difficult time of the pandemic and the George Floyd protests and the racial awakenings. And you really have to connect with people where they are and understand what they're going through and suffering, and let them know that you're there to support them. In terms of what I would do, I've only got 13 seconds as AG. One, you have to make sure that people are being paid fairly and supported in that way. And so I would work very hard to do that. Two, you have to support people in their job and give them a sense of agency and that they're being heard. And I would do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you all. DC has a lot of top lawyers. What is your relationship with two of the other top lawyers? The MOLC, the Mayor's Office of Legal Counsel, Eugene Adams, and Betsy Cavendish at the Mayor's General Counsel. What should the relationship of the AG be with those actors? And what areas might you collaborate on?
Who's up first?
I'm right, I'm on it. You have 60 seconds, and we're going to start with Mr. Schwalb, move to Mr. Spiva, and then to Mr. Jones.
So I am not a politician. I'm a first-time candidate. I've spent the last years at the Justice Department and then in private practice. I do not have a prior relationship with anybody in the Office of Legal Counsel in the mayor's office or any relationship with the mayor. I will say this, that every one of us who lives in the District of Columbia and pays taxes in the District of Columbia deserves a government that works. And a relationship, a healthy attorney-client relationship between the Office of Attorney General and the mayor's office and the agencies is essential. And we need a resetting of the relationship. There are historical reasons. There are some personality reasons why that relationship right now is not what any of us would like. And what that does is it impacts the ability of our government to work and do what it should do for all of us. I believe you build relationships between attorney and client step by step by building trust, finding objectives that you share, putting some wins up on the board and moving on. And as an attorney, it's not about my win, it's about the client's win and not taking credit. So being a non-politician and coming afresh, I think, is an opportunity to reset the relationships in our government.
Mr. Spiva.
I don't have an existing relationship with the two officials you mentioned, but I do think that one of the things that I would work the hardest at coming in is to take down the temperature between the AG's office and the mayor and people under the mayor and the agencies under the mayor. I'm sure there's plenty of fault to go around in terms of the current tensions between the mayor and the AG, but it's not good for the city. I think we want to aim for partnership, collaboration, and cooperation as much as we can. I'll defend the independence of the office. And if we have to disagree, let it be over policy and not personality. And I will work very hard to try to make that so.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yes, I respect both of those legal minds immensely. I appeared before Eugene Adams as he's the chief judge of the Office of Administrative Hearings, and I was a practitioner before that court. I also worked for the Office of Cable Television, Film, Music, and Entertainment, where I was legislative counsel and had to work along with Betsy Cavendish when we're trying to get legislation passed, excuse me, not legislation, but regulations approved and promulgated for our agency. This is an interesting question. We don't know who's going to be on the other side of June 21st and who will remain, but I hope that I'll work in tandem with whoever's there, and especially these individuals, in a good working fashion. I think that we know of some of the tension that's there currently, and I think it's really important that the legal minds are guiding the district into the best direction to create a brighter future, because it's the district residents that are dealing with our work, and we owe it to them to give our best foot forward and collaborate responsibly for a brighter future.
Thank you.
Can you get beyond the law books and the legal offices? What experiences do you have or have you had in working directly with people who live in poverty? And more broadly, does the AG have a specific role to play in alleviating poverty in the district? 60 seconds, Mr. Spiva, Mr. Jones, Mr. Schwalb. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. I have a great deal of experience because as a lawyer who has represented people in poverty in many contexts, in the context of housing instability, in the context of voting rights, because oftentimes when Republican legislatures go after Black and brown folks and their voting rights, they also are going after folks who are predominantly low income. And so you can't just walk into the court and you can't just look at your law books and do those cases effectively. You need to be on, walk the streets and be in their homes, be in these folks' homes and talk to them and understand the struggles that they go through and understand the trauma that they've gone through in the terms of the Columbia Heights folks that I mentioned earlier. Some of those folks were riding around on city buses at night with children, looking for a place to stay. That's trauma. And you can't effectively represent them unless you understand it. More than that, I understand from my parents who both grew up in poverty. My grandmother's house had an outhouse, and I saw that as a young child. So I have an understanding, although I've been very fortunate myself, I'll hasten to add. So I'm not trying to say that I have been in poverty. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
So I started a law firm back in 2014 in order to help a friend who was low on means and an opportunity to get access to the courts and know-how. And that's put me on the front lines of important issues, and it kept picking up speed. And I've represented other folks who I had to work with closely on trying to make sure that we pay these fees, got justice that they deserve, and we're advocating for their rights effectively. So I've cut my teeth on important cases in probate court and landlord tenant and DC Superior Court on the civil side, where people didn't have the means. And I believe as an attorney general, you have to be aware that people need access to the courts. And so I think it's critical that AG's office works with clinics around the city to enable people who don't have the means to have their rights protected, so they're not taken advantage of by bad actors who are exploiting some of the value that they have without their knowledge. And good lawyers can do that, protect people.
Okay. When Carl Racine ran,
Just a second,
he said,
Shelley.
Mr. Schwalb.
oh, watch me every,
I was hoping you would answer for me, Dean Broderick.
you gotta watch me every second, sorry.
The first case I ever tried when I was the president of the Legal Aid Bureau in law school was for a woman who was facing eviction. She was a young mother with 2 infant babies. She didn't speak English, and her landlord was threatening to throw her out into the cold of the winter in Boston. I saw firsthand how critical the law was in protecting people who were poor and who were on the edge of homelessness, in keeping her and her children in her home by fighting back against the deplorable conditions in her home and staving off eviction. I represented Freddie Woods, who was facing the death penalty in Alabama, and particularly when talking about the penalty penalty and phase of his trial and dealing with whether or not his life had any value. We spent a lot of time talking about what abject poverty in Alabama looked like and how it impacted the trajectory of his life. As a mentor on the Abramson Scholarship Foundation for the last decade, I've been working with kids in our city who have not had the privileges that my daughters have had. I'll bring all of those experiences when I'm serving as AG to be in the forefront of my mind.
Thank you very much. Shelley?
Okay, I'm gonna try to behave. When Carl ran, he ran on a platform that said, I'm gonna stop locking up Black boys. The OAG has sought reforms in juvenile justice system to achieve better outcomes for children involved in their cases. What's your assessment of these reforms, and what would you do differently to address this important community issue? You'll have 90 seconds to try to tackle this brutal question. And we're going to start with Mr. Jones, move to Mr. Schwalb, and then to Mr. Spiva. Mr. Jones?
You know, out on this campaign trail, I mentioned that this experience has changed me immeasurably, and I can't go back to the guy that I was before. And I've heard stories from across the city with how we need to address the crime that's spiking. Crime that's spiking, I believe, is a result of the despair people are experiencing from a pandemic and other factors that were existing and only been exacerbated during the pandemic. And so now we're asking an attorney general to step in and generally deter young people from engaging in crime, and specifically deter them from engaging in crime, so that we are keeping our streets safe for everybody. However, we're looking at trying to balance that with restorative justice and ensure that young people have a chance to have a successful life. And so I've heard all types of theories. You know, you're getting kids locked up, and then you're letting them go, and then they just have a free reign to continue to do bad things. We have to balance this. We have to think of some new ways to ensure that people are safe. And I don't believe it's the OAG alone to be Superman. You have to collaborate with the mayor's office. You have to collaborate with MPD. You have to collaborate with all of the other police forces around the city in order to stand down crime, to keep it from happening in the first place, and figure out new ways to prevent these bad actors from continuing in a certain fashion. Because the truth is, we don't want these crimes to persist. So I think it's a difficult answer to try to, resolve here in a minute and 30 seconds. But I hope what I've given was some food for thought for what we can do.
Mr. Schwalb.
So when we're talking about the reality of how we've over incarcerated, particularly Black men in our country and in our city, we're looking at a long history of systemic racism that none of us should ignore. We have to realize that the thought leadership that comes from the Attorney General as the chief law officer and thought leader on issues of justice and fairness sets the tone on how we address issues. I think we have to avoid being politicians looking for sound bites and candidly 90-second answers to complicated questions like this. But here's what I do think we have to do. We have to address crime that's happening now, particularly juvenile justice crime, by holding young people who are committing repeat violent offenses accountable. But that means our system has to work. Cases need to get closed. The police need to collect admissible, constitutionally acquired evidence. Our courts have to allow cases to be processed. The evidence has to be handled correctly. And then meaningful consequences have to be meted out. But even when we're providing consequences for bad behavior, we need to give kids resources so they can rehabilitate, so they can see a hopeful future for themselves, so that they don't recidivate. And that makes all of us safer. We have to lean into what the role of policing is in addressing crime. And then we have to attack the root causes of crime. Fortunately, we don't have to start fresh with this. We have a Jails and Justice Task Force, 80 specific recommendations that have already been put on the books, and we need to start leaning into implementing them. I don't have to start afresh with this. All I got to do is pick it up and advocate for some action on some, if not all of those 80 suggestions.
Works for me. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. I think we need to separate it into at least two categories. Professor Henning of Georgetown, in her excellent book, The Rage of Innocence, has shown that there are many crimes, quote unquote, that if done in a predominantly white school, we would call disciplinary problems, and there would be a trip to the principal's office at worst. But if they happen in predominantly Black or brown schools, we call them crimes, and they result in an arrest and entanglement in the juvenile justice system. That must stop. And I will do everything that I can to break the school to prison pipeline. I do recognize and acknowledge that some of our youth, and I'm the father of two young Black boys, young men now. It's hard to keep that in my mind that they're actually now young men. But and so this is a very real issue for me, whether they might be a victim of crime or have some kind of encounter with the police. We even when our kids, and I call them consciously our kids, because all of them are our kids, commit serious crimes. Yes, there has to be accountability, but we must always remember that they are kids. I'm very much against sending children into adult prisons, even after they reach adulthood. We need other options, wraparound services, mental health counseling, substance abuse counseling, and education to ultimately get them back on track. Accountability, yes, but ultimately these are our kids, and we want them to have productive, healthy lives in the future.
Thank you.
Legislation has been enacted during the pandemic aimed at reforming eviction procedures. I'm assuming you support what has been enacted. The question is, does the eviction crisis still exist? And if so, why? Moreover, what should the AG do about it, if anything? Got 60 seconds there. Mr. Schwalb, Mr. Spiva, and Mr. Jones.
I think we are still facing an eviction crisis. I think when the moratorium lifts, we're going to see a flood of eviction cases being filed. We know that our Superior Court is going to be already overwhelmed. We're down judges already. The landlord-tenant branch has the phenomena of seeing a flood of eviction cases pre-pandemic, where the vast majority of tenants not represented by lawyers and the vast majority of landlords represented by lawyers. But I do think the law has to get back to working in that there is a right of a landlord to collect rent, and that there is a time when eviction proceedings are appropriate. Why we have an eviction crisis is an economic crisis. It's a one of jobs and an opportunity for people to afford to live in the city. And the law needs to recognize that when we focus on other issues of equity in our city and a right to decent, affordable housing and healthcare and a job, we can start to alleviate the pressures of tenants who aren't able to pay their rent.
Mrs. Spiva.
Thank you. Yes, we still have an eviction crisis. We have a lack of affordable housing crisis. We have a poverty crisis in the city, and all those things contribute to that. And so what I would like to do is use every tool that I would have as Attorney General, working with the excellent professionals in the office to try, by the way, I don't think they may not have reset the clock on this one. Okay, I'll try to be, I know I've already had some time, so I'll try to be brief. I want to try to do all that I can to increase safe and affordable housing. And so that means using the tools that we have in terms of consumer protection and housing laws that allow us to go after slumlords who deliberately let their buildings go down, to push tenants out so they can turn them into high-end condos. And if necessary, putting the landlords into receivership and making the repairs, and if necessary, forcing them to sell. I want to enforce the promises that landlords make in exchange for city money to create affordable housing. They don't always keep those promises. We probably also need a change in the law to make affordable really mean affordable. So lowering the income standards for that type of housing. I think the new program of using the zoning laws to increase affordable housing is also a very promising thing. So I would use every tool that I had to try to increase or maintain a supply of affordable, safe housing. Thank you.
We're coming up now close to closing statements. I'd like to slip in one question that I think is important.
Excuse me, Mr. King,
Mr.
I don't know if Ryan
I'm sorry,
Jones had a
Mr. Jones.
chance.
I'm sorry. I'll tell your mother, Denise Champion, I apologize.
So I think we have a real crisis, and I think it's not a simple solution. We're going to have to try to expedite these cases that are backlogged, and we're going to have to work collectively with it. I think we're also talking about a free market that's going to be operating. I think we're going to have to ask for some money. We're going to have to ask for some forgiveness, because what's coming is going to be something that we haven't already seen. Can we keep extending the moratorium? The answer is no. So are we going to have to say, hey, look, landlord, we'll step in and pay down some of the costs that you've incurred. Hey, renter, we'll step in and enhance some of the emergency renter services for you, so that we're not having to crank these cases out too quickly, and in doing so, that haste causing an injustice and a very harsh result for DC residents, historic DC residents, which then could exacerbate a crime problem. So we have to see how it all works together, and we're gonna have to work tirelessly with one another to resolve this issue.
Thank you. We're coming up now on closing arguments, or closing, I'm sorry, lawyers, closing statements. I was tempted to do that. You have 2 minutes each. Mr. Spiva, Mr. Jones, Mr. Schwalb. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you so much, Washington Council of Lawyers and the other organizations co-sponsoring it, Mr. King and Dean Broderick. A great Washingtonian, Frederick Douglass, once said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And I believe that when we see an injustice, we must never walk away. We have a moral obligation to fight to try to try to change it. And that's the reason I believe that we were put on this earth. And that's why I want to be Attorney General. I'll wake up every morning thinking about how to make positive change for everyday people. I want to fight for housing justice, fighting slumlords and increasing affordable and habitable housing. I want to fight for criminal justice reform and violence interruption. I want to fight for civil rights and workers' rights, consumer protection and environmental justice. Now, these are not aspirations that came along to me during this election season. I've got a lifelong record of fighting for the people and winning. For 30 years, when my clients had no one else to turn to, when other lawyers were too worried about how they'd get paid to pay them any mind, I was there in their corner, fighting for them to help them achieve justice. When no one else would hear them, I used the gifts that I'd been given to lift up their voices and help them tell their stories. I'm going to be an Attorney General who uses the power of the office to fight for those who have been left out and left behind, If you want a leader who is the most experienced and best prepared based on what I've been doing the last 30 years to lead an office of 700 professionals to fight for the people, and if you want a leader who is willing, when necessary, to walk up the rough side of the mountain and face the heat of the day and inspire others to join us, send me. I'm ready and I'm eager to do the job. Thank you so much.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you so much. You mentioning my mom just warms my heart. And I stepped out into this journey not knowing all that would come. I move with them as my inspiration. I want nothing more to make my parents proud, but also to make district residents safer and have a real opportunity at success, which is the promise of this country. I want to use the Office of Attorney General to create an opportunity for people to live empowered lives. We can do that with the law. I talk about creating a task force that pairs with the ACLU, pairs with DC Crime Lab and Justice Roundtable to reevaluate the code. I talk about creating an expungement clinic that'll give people a real chance at having the opportunity to be meaningful contributors to society by getting access to counsel that will help them expunge their records on a case-by-case basis. I talk about ensuring that people have a chance to succeed and because they can get their wealth created to them by their families. So how do we do that? We create a wills and trust clinic, give people real access to legal work that then allows them to pass down and protect their assets. Lastly, a big pillar is public advocacy. That's a big role of the Attorney General's office, and I want nothing more to expand it. Need to know that people need to know, businesses need to know, if you come to DC and harm DC or its residents, you will be held accountable. And we're going to get results that pay DC back and deter bad actors from participating in those types of actions in the future. DC is where I'm from. It's my hometown. You know, I watched what happened in 2020 and that inspired me to run for office because I know that we needed to do something. I know that we needed new leaders to step in with a new vision to cure old problems. I don't want to treat symptoms. I want to treat the virus where it resides. And that requires going into a system and rewiring it in order to empower people. Thank you so much for your time. I really would like your vote, and please consider me June 21st for this election. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. King, Dean Broderick, to everybody who's listening. I wish we could have done this in person, but alas, another Zoom call almost over. I think we have a really important decision as voters in the District of Columbia as to who our next Attorney General is going to be. And selecting an Attorney General to step in to fight the important fights and take on the significant challenges we're facing as a city and as a country right now is a little bit like trying to figure out who do you pick as a doctor when someone you love is facing an incurable disease. I know what that's like. When my girls were 5, 3, and 18 months old, my wife, Mickey, was diagnosed with what we were told was an incurable form of cancer, a cancer called multiple myeloma. And what we did was we asked for a trusted referral. We asked our friends who knew what to look for, who would you recommend? We have a trusted referral in this election. We have our first independently elected Attorney General, Karl Racine, who by all accounts has done a very, very good job. In fact, every candidate in this race has stepped up and said that Karl Racine has set the bar. Karl and Irv Nathan before him, they know what it takes to lead this office, to take on the fights that the office has to fight, and they've both endorsed me in my campaign. I think they did that because they recognize the essential elements of an attorney general: lawyering experience, 30 plus years, trying all kinds of different cases, civil rights cases and death penalty cases to be sure, but also bankruptcy and tax and complex commercial and property cases. And only through that process is the judgment of being able to distinguish cases earned. I've led trial teams. I've tried cases and stood up before juries in courts of appeals. I've also led large teams of lawyers in law offices. So lawyering and leadership is important, but so is independence. I'm not a politician. I'm a fair election candidate, and that's really important in this election. I will not be beholden to anybody. I will fight for the city and the people who live in the city and put the law to work for everybody so we live in a better and safer place. Thank you, and I hope I'll earn your vote on June 21st.
Thank all of you. As is often the case, questions come to mind, but they come too late or you don't have enough time. Tonight's candidates cannot be accused of either. We thank them for their time and their willingness to participate in this forum, which is for the benefit of the voters, the June 21st DC Democratic primary. We wish all of you the very best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Take
And
care.
I just want to make sure that you're going to remember your public law school, UDC, when you're hiring interns, postgraduate fellows, and lawyers. And you're all going to guest lecture at my state and local government class like Carl does every semester, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Very important conversation. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.